Hi, I'm Gogo. I'm really excited to be here today because finally I'm making a Gen 2 and also Gen 1 1290 Super Duke setup video. So we have Danny Howe's Gen 1, a 2014 1290 Super Duke R, which is the first bike, the first of the 1290s that I raced. So why I'm so excited is because when I started to race this bike, nobody was racing it. And I really stumbled and fumbled, and we tried so hard to get this bike to work better because, you know, it's a lot of fun as a street bike. When you get on the track, it's more difficult, it's more challenging. You're hitting bumps at 3 times the speed you would be on the street. You're trying to turn leaned over at angles you wouldn't even get to on the street. So it's more challenging to set a bike up for the track than it is to set a bike up for the street. So it was difficult. A lot of trial and error, a lot of fumbling, sometimes going slower. But ultimately, eventually, by the 3rd season, which actually is like the 6th season, because the Gen 1 raced for a few years, then the Gen 2 raced for a few years, I actually got this bike to work extremely well. So well that I would get off the bike and say, I think that this is my favorite bike I've ever raced, ever. Because the bike would just go. When you're coming up behind somebody and you're thinking, man, I would like to tighten my line up and go underneath them and exit, it would just go underneath them. And I'd start to twist the throttle and get that driving grip and say, maybe I can drive, you know, under them or come around them, and it would just do it. It was amazing. It was amazing. This is like fantastic. So when I sold the bike, my Gen 2, which was a 2017, I knew I was getting the Gen 3. And just before the guy came to pick it up, I had this thought. I should probably write things down. I should probably write down where we got to before I started into the Gen 3. So I took Danny's bike. Danny was nice enough to lend us his bike. I took my Gen 2. By the way, the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 are identical. Frames, swing arms, shock lengths, all that stuff. Steering head angle, it's the same bike. So I took a Gen 1, a Gen 2, and my new, at that time, Gen 3. Brought them all to Jerry Piazza's. He's like a local genius around here, straightens frames and measures things. And I got the bikes measured so we could see what was the swing arm angle that I ultimately ended up with, and what was the shock length, and where was the steering head, and where exactly was that bike compared to the way the bike comes stock. And this is really valuable information. I'm glad we took the time to do that and spent the money, because it costs money, because I get to do this thing that annoys anybody on my race team. It always has, and it always will. When I find a secret, like something that's just incredible, that works just amazing, the first thing I usually do is tell everybody. And everybody on my team says, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you tell everybody this secret thing? I don't know, but here we are doing it again. So there's a whole list of things. There's all these numbers behind me that will kind of explain where we were stock and where we ended up to in the most successful race configuration, which, by the way, is also the most successful track day configuration, which is important because I know a lot of people have contacted me about their Gen 2 and they want to ride on the track, or they want to be more successful on the track days, racing, whatever. So I had the courage, thankfully, to go think way outside the box and do some radical things, which some of them didn't work at all, and some of them worked amazingly well. So here is the configuration of how, when it worked really well. So this is really interesting to me, because I'm kind of a geek when it comes to this stuff. But it's also interesting to you because not only am I going to tell you where we ended up, but more importantly, how we ended up there. Like, so you can too. So one thing first is rake and trail. So rake is the angle of your forks, your steering head, your forks, which can change, right? As you set the bike up, as you change the height of the shock, slide the forks down and pick them up, so your rake can change. And the trail, you can also affect your trail. If I was to just loosen these triple clamps and lift the bike up a little bit and tighten them, I would change the rake and I would change the trail. You might say, what the hell is the trail? If you already know, I apologize. If you don't know, this will be a really interesting, easy way to understand. The trail is, if you imagine the steering head, right, where this bolt is here, there's a shaft that goes through with the bearings that your forks rotate on, right? If you were to imagine a line going straight down the center of your steering head, the center of those bearings, and it would project the line and it would come down, that steering head somewhere to like the floor. Let's say it came down to somewhere like here. Then you were to plot a line from the center of your axle straight down, a plumb line, straight down. So your trail is the difference, is this measurement in between those two numbers. So you can imagine, if you just exaggerate, like say you jack the bike way up, so the forks would more of an angle, right? So this plumb line is gonna stay there, but as you jack the bike up, this line's gonna come back, right? That steering head angle is gonna change like this, or it's gonna change like that. As the rear of the bike goes down or comes up, that distance is gonna grow or get shorter. So that's your trail. And there's a way to illustrate this would make it very easy to understand, but basically if you just took my word for it, when your trail numbers are higher number, the motorcycle, like, you could let go, no hands, and hit bumps at 120 miles an hour. Bike's gonna keep going straight. It's just so stable and so straight. That's great, but the downside of that is when you're trying to turn and flick the bike from this side and flick the bike from that side and go through chicanes or something at a track, it's slower. It's so slow to handle. So there's a happy place. Maybe on the street, you're only going 60 miles an hour. Maybe that is the happy place, the way it comes stock. The way this bike, a Gen 1 and a Gen 2 comes stock, is there's 111.2 millimeters of trail. That plumb line through your axle, that angled through your steering head, that distance is 111.2 millimeters long. When I was done doing all the things that we did to my Gen 2, we ended up with 101.5 millimeters of trail. So that number got a lot shorter. That's 3/4 of a mile. Maybe that's even like 1.5 miles. That's a lot. It's a big, big difference. And that number, 101, is, I don't believe in like, oh, there's a certain number of trail that's for every bike. Bullshit. I don't believe in that at all. Every bike is different. Every rider is different. Where you put your weight when you're in a turn, where maybe some people are back here, some people are here. Maybe some people get way off and lean forward. There's so many different things that you can do that will make your bike handle maybe not so well with 101 millimeters, maybe better with 104 millimeters. You make those decisions yourself. That's the beauty of working with a motorcycle to get to a better place. But in general, you can see those are huge differences. Maybe you'll be, something for you would be better at 102, 103, or maybe 100 for you in particular, but you're not going to be very far off this number, I don't think. So the other thing that we did that's made a very big impact on the motorcycle is this swing arm length. So, you know, swing arm, when you talk about the length or the angle, it doesn't matter like all these fancy shapes up and down loopy, it doesn't matter. It's the pivot point, that pivot point to the axle. So even though you have the same swing arm on this bike, and this is a tricky, beautiful, and frustrating thing, we have a concentric that can rotate where the axle is. So even though it's the same swing arm, our swing arm length can be this, or our swing arm length can be that. It's the same swing arm, but one is much longer than the other. So what we did is we ended the bike up with a 618.2 millimeters of length from 603.7 stock. That's a difference of, thank you, Danny Howe, 14.5 millimeters longer than stock. So there's a couple of things that does and did to help on the track, to help the bike perform better under like these conditions. One is the longer the swing arm is, the farther back the rear axle is, the more weight is put on the front, which kind of helps in a turn, right? More weight on the front, more traction. You can actually feel the difference when you're in a turn. Say you're on a bike and you just lean out like this, or you're on a bike and you lean out and you kind of rotate your elbow in and you lean forward, you'll feel the bike turning differently. You'll feel different levels of confidence with the traction of the front tire. It's a fascinating experiment that you can do. So you put more weight on the front. You also, which also helps you, right? More weight on the front when you're exiting the turn. Everybody knows that these bikes, Danny, love to wheelie. Right? How much fun is that? Love to wheelie. But when you are racing the stopwatch, you hate to wheelie because you got to get off the gas. And nobody wants to get off the gas ever when you're racing the clock. So you just want to get in it, get on it. And having a longer swing arm, having a little more weight put up on the front is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's a fast thing. So that's one thing, that's one major difference that we did, is getting the swing arm back, the swing arm longer. There's other reasons, there's other things that affects, which we'll get into in a second. Okay, so the next thing on our list is wheelbase, which is a little bit confusing because when the bike was stock, it had 111 millimeters of trail, which as a monkey would think about it, so just the forks are extended out. Okay, that's pretty far. That's the way the bike came stock. Then we made the changes that we made to the rear, right? Which we haven't even talked about all the changes yet, but just the swing arm length, making the swing arm longer, being that it's on an angle, it's lifting the bike up. So it's going like this. So we made our trail numbers come down, but we did make the swing arm longer. So we have a wheelbase measured from that point to that point of 11 millimeters longer than stock. 1495 to 1506. Now, who's going to measure their wheelbase and say, you know what I mean? But that's just a measured note. Swing arm angle. This is important, and this is actually really kind of cool because there's something called a chain moment. It's also referred to with different words, thought of in a different way. But if you could just accept this visual, you have your countershaft sprocket right there, and you've got your rear sprocket here, right? And if you imagine, you don't really have to even imagine that hard because it actually happens. When you accelerate, this chain gets pulled forward like this. And depending on the angle of your swing arm, sometimes when you pull it, it's going to lift the swing arm. It's the simplest way to think of it. What it's actually doing is pushing down the center of the bike, but let's just think of it in a very simple way. When we accelerate with a flat swing arm, right? The swing doesn't really have much of an angle. And we accelerate forward, we're going to lift the swing arm, and the bike's going to squat down like this. That's bad, because a swing arm that squats, a bike that squats in the back, when this comes down, you're going to wheelie like this. Not only are you going to wheelie, but you're also going to lose the ability to turn. Let's say you're leaned over and you're in a turn, and you're going through the turn, and you feel like you can visualize your trajectory through the turn. You can see like I'm pointed this way, but the apex is over there, and I'm looking forward, and I can see that apex, and I can tell through this invisible line that you're projecting that you're going to make that final apex. So you feel good, and you start to dial in the throttle. Okay, now I'm going to start to get this bike out of this turn. And the problem is, as soon as you dial that throttle and the back starts to squat a little bit, that line, now it changes. Now that line's, here's where your bike's going, but the apex is over there. This is a problem. So squatting is bad because that line goes like this, it goes like this. So that's why you lose time in a turn, because you start to accelerate, you lose that trajectory, and then you have to adjust. And then when you decelerate, it comes back, and you wait, and everyone passes you, and then you can exit the turn. So squatting is never, in my book, never a good thing. So that's what happens with a flat swing arm. And stock, do we have the Swingarm Angle stock? Oh, we do. So stock, when the bike comes stock, the Swingarm Angle is 7.5 degrees, which, if you Googled other bikes, Ducatis, this and that, they're usually much steeper than that. So that's a pretty flat swing arm. I did everything that I could do to work out the gearing changes, the sprocket sizes, to a point where, because remember, when we adjust the chain on these bikes, remember there's a circle that is that eccentric piece, the concentric, whatever it's called, and that axle is positioned on the outer part of the circle. So we can adjust the chain forward so the axle is over here, or we can pull it back so the axle is down there. So we have all this adjustability. And the beauty and the challenge is you might need a sprocket, like you might like a sprocket, front countershaft sprocket and rear combination, where just because it's the way it works out, in order to get your chain to fit and to be adjusted right, you have to have the axle up and forward, which stinks, because the higher the axle is in the rotation, the lower the rear of the bike is. So when you lower the rear of the bike, you lose. You go closer to 7.5 degrees. You might even go under 7. You might go to 7 degrees. Even flatter swing arm. Even more of this problem with when you twist the throttle, it lifts up the swing arm or squats down the center of the bike, and you get this problem, right? You do not want this to happen. So I worked out, fortunately, because like I talked about in another video, the gearing, the transmission on these bikes, I don't believe they nailed. I don't even believe they came close to nailing, because I feel very strongly that like first, second, third, they're fine. The gears are fine. They pull really hard. The bike wheelies, you all have fun. It's a great time. But fourth, fifth, sixth, they're too tall. The gearing is too tall. So I believe with all my heart, this bike the best way to make this bike faster, probably the thing that has the biggest impression on how this bike accelerates and how this bike keeps accelerating beyond 100 miles an hour, is to change the gearing radically. So, but before we get into those numbers exactly, let me just say that I got this bike through camshaft sprocket size in the front and the back so that this axle is rotated back and down almost as far as it could go. It just worked out with the countershaft sprocket that I love the most, which was 15, stock is 17, and the rear sprocket size, which I found the best suited for me and the tracks I was running, which some are really tight, some are higher speed, and the bike always seemed to do really well with 40 tooth rear sprocket, 15, 40. So if you look back here, the bike comes with 17 up front, 38 in the rear. And I changed it to 15, 40. So some people say, most people say, that in the front on the countershaft sprocket, 1 tooth equals 3 teeth in the back. So if I went down 2 teeth in the front, that's 6 teeth different in the back. But then I went from 38 to 40, so that's 6, 7, 8. 8 teeth, how do you do that? 8 teeth shorter than stock, which sounds nuts until you ride the bike. First gear, I really only use in the pits. Start the bike and go out, make your way to the hot pit. Then once you hit the second, you never go back. You just, and I actually launch. I start the races from second gear. Don't use first gear. Started from second gear, and I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna blow the clutches up in one race, last the whole season. So it's shocking and it's surprising, and you're gonna say, I'm not doing that. Okay, don't. But for me, and for the success that we had on the racetrack, it was unbelievable. 15, 40, not only put the axle in an ideal spot for getting the most rear ride height, because remember, this bike, you can't adjust the ride height. Really, there's no, like on the Ducatis, there's a length you can change the height. You can't, unless you have a shock that has height adjustability, which is something that I did have, and we can get into that in a second, but how else can you adjust the ride height? You can't. If you have a stock bike, there's no other way to adjust the ride height. So you make that gearing change and wow, you get gearing plus rear ride height. So swingarm angle, swingarm length, ride height. Great, 3 things with 1 adjustment.